Welcome to qnawire.
Let's consider the effect of required fringe benefits on the labor market. So here we're supposing that a new law is requiring employers to pay their employees $3 in fringe benefits per hour worked. In part A, we'd like to draw a supply and demand diagram which shows the effect of this new law. So because these workers are going to have to pay this additional $3 per hour, what's happening is it's going to end up raising this marginal cost for these employers. So we see this increase in the marginal cost to employers. And as a result of the increase in marginal cost, we're going to see a reduction in their marginal profits. So because employers are going to see lower profits, they're going to end up demanding fewer workers. So we're going to see this demand curve shift leftward from D note to D1. Which means that our equilibrium has shifted as well. So we see our quantity go from Q note to Q1, so that's decreasing. And we see our wages drop as well from W note to W1. Now part B here, what we're doing is we're going to assume that there's no change in supply. How are employment and wages going to be affected if supply doesn't shift? So what we're going to see is because supply is remaining the same, essentially we see the quantity demanded remain, or the quantity supplied of labor is going to remain at Q note. However, the quantity demanded, like we just said, has reduced to Q1. So as a result of that, we're going to see higher levels of unemployment because people are still going to want to work. There just won't be the demand for it. So we're going to see, because this demand for labor is declining, we also see this unemployment go up. And it's because we have that gap that sits between Q1 and Q note. It's that disparity between our demand and supply. Now part C here, we're working under the assumption that the labor supply curve might shift as a result of this new law. And why exactly might this supply curve end up shifting? Well, it's because to employees, to these workers, these fringe benefits are pretty attractive. They want these benefits. So our supply might actually increase as a result of this. So we shift our supply curve from S note to S1, and we see our equilibrium change again. In this case, our quantity is going to be increasing from Q note to Q1, but our wages are still declining. Now, this is happening because this implementation of these newly required fringe benefits, it's leading to a sort of increase in the wages of the labor because these workers who are working, they're getting that additional $3. So to them, they're earning more. So the rise in the wages leads to this increase in supply. And that supply curve is shifting, like we just showed, from S note to S1. However, this increase in supply ends up reducing the wage rate. Because this fall in the wage happens, it might lead to some employment of some amounts of labor, and that's why we see that increase, right? Because employers, if they can lower their wages, they're going to hire more, and so we see that shift start to occur. Now, part D here, we want to know, assuming or taking a look at minimum wage workers, how does this new imposition of these fringe benefits, this new law, affect typical minimum wage workers? Well, the imposition of a minimum wage law typically leads to an increase in the wage rate. So right now we're working with a typical minimum wage law. What happens is we see an increase in wages that's typically going to be above that equilibrium wage. And as a result of this, we see the demand for labor falls because employers don't want to pay more. They're going to hire fewer workers. And this imposition of the fringe benefits, it kind of does a very similar thing. So because this imposition of the fringe benefits, on top of these minimum wage workers, we're going to see our wages even further increase, meaning that the demand for labor is going to decrease even more. So the gap that we have between the supply of labor and demand for labor is only going to continue to widen. So we can see that, like in part A, how our quantities were, we saw that disparity, that gap between them. We're only going to see that gap further widen as a result of these fringe benefits on top of any minimum wage laws that currently exist.